Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Excellent, thank you. So are we recording?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I am Nicole Lawrence. As Sheila said, I am the Assistant Director for the Digital Library of Georgia, and today I'm going to talk to you about making your metadata more reusable by people who use it in bulk. So that would be metadata aggregators like us and kind of a new breed of researchers that are coming in, digital humanists, software developers, people of the like, who are going to be using your records, the whole of your records rather than picking through it for one record or one piece of content at a time. So before we go too far, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit in case you're not familiar with me. I have been with the Digital Library of Georgia for about 2.5 years now. I have a lot of roles, but one of my primary responsibilities is evaluating and designing our metadata workflows. So that includes harvesting from all of our partners with digital asset management systems, making sure that our editing and ingesting of metadata goes smoothly, and kind of working to make sure that's as efficient as possible. Prior to being with the Digital Library of Georgia, I was with the Mississippi Digital Library, where I served in a similar capacity. So my metadata folks, and Sheila will tell you that I get very excited when I get to improve a metadata workflow. So I'm excited to be talking to you about this. So I'm going to cover a few things today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about why and how we use your metadata, how we harvest it, and how we reuse it. I'm going to speak primarily from our experience as a cultural heritage aggregator. Those of us that do aggregation work, we tend to use the same processes, even if it's not the same technology. So what we do is not dissimilar from what other aggregators or even researchers using your materials in bulk will be doing. I also want to cover our metadata profile, and that is to give you a little bit of an idea of exactly how we use your metadata. And from there, I'll talk about structuring your metadata for bulk access. Hopefully we'll spend the bulk of the time talking about this, and then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about things we've learned looking and working with common digital asset management systems that are out there and in use in Georgia among libraries and museums and other cultural heritage institutions. And hopefully I've built in enough time for lots of questions. I know that when I do talks like these, often people have very specific questions to tailor to their data set or their asset management system. So I encourage you to ask those questions. If I don't have an answer, I promise I will find one for you. So without further ado, let's talk about why we even do this work. Why do we harvest your records in bulk and use records in aggregate? The Digital Library of Georgia is primarily a metadata aggregator. We do some imaging and hosting services, but what we do is we find all of the siloed information that's out in all these disparate repositories, right? So your repositories, and we bring it all together, hopefully to provide a better picture and an easy and friendly way for researchers who want this information to get at it. Practically, what that looks like is that we put everything together in a unified search that people can get the content results that they're looking for without having to know the ins and outs of the cultural heritage world in the state of Georgia or in the Southeast or even in the nation in the case of organizations like the Digital Public Library of America. And what this looks like, these are screenshots of the holding institution facet on our website. What this means is that when a researcher comes to our website and is looking for a particular piece of content or information on a particular topic, they might know that Georgia State University and the University of Georgia has a lot of materials related to that, but what they might not know is that they could also look at places like Roosevelt Warm Springs Vocational Rehabilitation Campus, which has materials related to it, or Chattahoochee Valley Regional Library System. So there's a lot of places that information exists in our in our region, and we try to pull that all together to make sure that we're providing as much access to history as possible. So that is why we as cultural heritage aggregators use data in bulk. But with the evolving technology and internet landscapes, it's really difficult to understand why people, or know why people would be looking at your materials, at all of your materials, and not just trying to find one particular letter or set of materials related to a topic. So there are a lot of really interesting projects out there that make use of bulk data sets. These are just a few examples. The links are clickable, so when you have access to these after the recording, you're welcome to explore these. But there are things that, like this particular project from Berkeley. These are some digital humanists who are using really large data sets to try to teach machines how to do automatic authorship attribution in the Hebrew Bible and among other texts. And why bulk data is important for these folks is because the more data that they have, the better sample they have to teach the machines, which means the better results, in theory, they should get, which might not be the kind of things that you're used to researchers using your collections for, but it's the reality of our world right now, is people are using these things to teach machines to look for all kinds of different things that you might not realize your content is useful for. One of the more interesting things that I have come across is this Google Arts and Culture experiment called X degrees of separation. This allows you to input 2 images from a large selection of freely available images, and it creates an image gradient of sorts. So the first one I picked was the letter on the left, and the second one I picked was the dress on the right. And Google generated this sort of image gradient that goes not only from by color left to right, but also by form left to right. I don't know how practical this is, but people are doing these sorts of things with your data. And we want them to do these things, right? This is probably very useful for somebody and draws connections that they wouldn't otherwise see without the ability to get at our information in bulk. So I'll talk a little bit about how we do this. At the Digital Library of Georgia, this is our data supply chain. What I do want to note is that this is everything that we do in metadata harvesting and processing. The bulk of this talk hopefully will be focused on these 2 portions highlighted in the brackets, harvesting and exported data. So I'll breeze quickly through the rest of this so you have some context for what we're looking at in your data. And why we would be using it in certain ways. If you do have more questions about how we do any of those things, I will be happy to answer them, but hopefully we'll spend most of the time talking about this one very specific piece that is your information and the stuff that you have control over in your digital asset management system. So we do gather information from a number of different sources. Once we have it, we run it through a bit of processing. And then we put it into our metadata management system, which we call DLG admin. And then it goes out to the places that you're probably most familiar with, like the Georgia portal, our Digital Library of Georgia main website, or even our own data feeds to larger aggregators like the Digital Public Library of America and EBSCO. Typically, how we harvest information from asset management systems is through some sort of exposed endpoint or an export of data. The most common way endpoint is an OAI PMH endpoint. That stands for Open Archives Initiative's Protocol for Metadata Harvesting. And it is just a structured output. It's a place that we can go ask your system for some information and then get a list of structured machine readable results back. If you work with an asset management system that does not have an OAI feed or some sort of API, PastPerfect online museum software is a good example of this, then we can take exports, right? And hopefully that's a low barrier way to contribute to aggregations like ours. You should be able to export your data in some sort of spreadsheet or separated value file that you can send over to the aggregator. And this is what a typical response from an OAI provider looks like. This is a simple Dublin Core XML that we got from, I think this is Mercer. But this is typically what a data set that we would be working with looks like. Once we have the data set, we do a number of steps in it, but to it before there are a number of steps that it goes through before we can ingest it into our system. First, we normalize any of the fields that we validate in our system. This means that our users have really great faceting on our search results, and fields that you might see us do some sort of normalizing to your data would be fields like date. We have a very specific date format that we have to meet in order for our date features to work. So we'll take any variation of a date that you give us and convert it into our format, our preferred format. Once all of that's done, we do a bit of enhancement. We do missing fields. We do add some missing fields, and I want to point out that these are not content related fields. So we're not going to be adding any additional like content related descriptive metadata to what you've provided to us. These are things that we wouldn't find in the wild already in your information. Identifiers that we assign your records, for example, or collections that we've assigned to your digital collections, right? So things that you wouldn't necessarily need to provide in your information is what we add, but we won't do any additional descriptive work to it. We then map your fields to the fields in use by our management system. So we make sure that everything gets properly from one record to the next record. And then we convert it to our XML and ingest it into our system. Once we do that, if we have successfully converted your records without any mistakes and there's no validation errors, we can commit those directly to our management system. It does give us a chance to fix any errors that we do come across, so like if we did not format a date properly. And once that is committed, it gets pushed into our metadata management system, which is on the left, and out to the public interfaces that you're probably used to, like the DLG website, the Civil Rights Digital Library. From here, we can edit, change, modify, delete as necessary. So that is very quickly the basic process for getting a harvested set of records into the DLG. One thing I do want to talk about a little bit right now is our metadata profile. This is a relatively new document. We've provided it to help folks know exactly what we're doing with your metadata, and also so that our bulk users can know what they're going to see when it comes out of our system. It's based heavily on the Digital Public Library of America's metadata application profile. They use 5 or 6 different namespaces. We use 3 namespaces. If you don't know what a namespace is, that's perfectly fine. It's not necessary to know. The very short of it, it is the abbreviation before a colon in a metadata field tag, so that in this particular screenshot, it would be the DC. If you are curious, you are welcome to take a look at our application profile. It will be available. The link in the presentation works, and we will also be putting this on our documentation site, so you're welcome to look at it for your own reference. So what does our metadata profile include? Well, what it's not is a description of how we'd like to see the particular contents of a field formatted. There is a link to that document, so we do have metadata guidelines and best practices. So if you are curious about how we would suggest that you format a title per se, you can click on that link and it'll take you there. What this will do is give you the, on the left, to the field name in plain English. It will tell you whether or not it is required for us to ingest it into our system. There are only a handful of absolutely have to have fields. If you don't have one of those fields, we can't actually ingest your records into our system without a significant amount of work. It will also tell you whether or not we validate those fields on ingest. This is particularly important because not all fields are not all fields have to be required in order to be validated. So coverage temporal is a really good example of this. It refers to the date of a document, right? It's not required to ingest metadata into our system. However, if it does get provided to us, it is validated and it has to be in the particular date format that we need. So we'll have to do normalization on it. We also tell you whether or not in our system a field is repeatable. And there are 4 fields that are not, which means that there has to be a one-to-one relation between these particular fields in each of your records. So there can only be one holding institution, one metadata and digital object URL. Now these can be the same URL, but we can only enter one in each of those fields in our system, and then only one standardized rights statement. We then list for you where we would expect to see these values in simple doubling core and qualified doubling core. This doesn't mean we can't harvest records if we don't see the same value in this field. It's just what we, if we hadn't talked to you and just pulled your records, where we would expect to see this information. And then for your reference, we list what we call that field in our metadata system. So that's a bit of context for how we use records and why we use records. So let's spend some time talking about the structure of your records for people who are using it in bulk. I think traditionally, especially when we were starting to develop digital collections, for those of us who have been doing it for a very long time, we thought that people would use digital collections in the same manner as they do collections in a reading room, which is not an untrue statement, right? We were expecting historians and genealogists to come in and be searching for a particular bit of information on you know, a very specific topic. And that does happen. A lot of the people who use our websites, who use our content portals, are using our materials like this. However, there is a new breed of people using our materials that are far less familiar with historical content, even the way we structure our information. And these are people like mathematicians. There was an example on that how are people using your stuff slide, where some mathematicians are digitally restoring old paintings, right? So they're not going to be, they're from a very different discipline and not as familiar with the way that we categorize things in the cultural heritage world, library and archives world. We've got web developers who are developing all kinds of neat apps that use our materials, computer scientists, and then you've got really savvy digital humanists and historians and even genealogists who are learning that they can draw all kinds of neat connections between materials when they look at it en masse. A very important thing to note is that in the bulk data world, a lot of the searching actually happens post data collection. And this is very different than somebody going to your website and putting in a search term and being able to use your facets and see your tool tips and search tips and help pages, right? A lot of times what people will do is find an endpoint, get all the records, and then sort through them after the fact to find the things that they're looking for. So it can be really difficult because to figure out how exactly someone is using your materials because you don't have the aid of analytics for figuring out who's searching for what terms and what got the most hits. But this is okay. There are ways to aid them in their research even though you don't have that sort of kind of indirect or more direct connection with them, right? What they are looking for, and what we look for at the DLG when we're ingesting records and trying to do our processing, what a researcher is going to be looking for, is patterns in description. What can they count on to be in a place or put in a way that they can extract that information out consistently? If you take nothing else away from this talk, I hope it is this particular sentence. I'm gonna spend a little bit of time talking about ways that you can structure your data to be more efficient, but please know that consistency is the single most important factor in data reusability. There are, in the metadata world, there's a lot of different schemas. There's a lot of different ways of formatting things. It's kind of like the Wild West. There isn't one single standard to rule them all. However, people who are using your data in bulk, as long as they can figure out which way you've chosen to structure your data, they'll be able to use it. Where it becomes problematic is when that consistency isn't there, because you can't reliably extract the bits of information that you need in order to complete your research, or to make sure that you're mapping the right fields into your portal. So probably the most important thing I would say when you are putting together your digital collections, when thinking about bulk use, is maintain consistent patterns in field usage and order. And what I mean by this is, if you have 15 digital collections and you're putting dates in every single collection, make sure that you call your date field the same thing in every collection, right? In these particular examples, one collection has published date and one has year range. And then always put the same date in there. If it's the date of creation, then include the date of creation. Don't switch it in another collection to a publication date or an edited date, right? So make sure that you're being consistent in what you're calling fields and what the content that you're putting in them. But one of the things that people don't realize is that the order in which fields appear can be really is a really important pattern that people using your data in bulk see. Oftentimes, in not so robust metadata schemas, like simple Dublin Core, you will have a number of the same fields. So a Dublin Core identifier is a really good example of this. A Dublin Core identifier often contains things like the URL to the digital object, a local identifier like a file name, or just a digital object identifier. It can contain URLs to finding aids. There's a lot of different things that get smushed into the DC identifier field. And so if among your collections, collection 1 has the URL to your digital object in the first position, and in collection 2 has it in the last position, and collection 3, nobody really paid attention to the order, so it kind of bounces around. It makes it really difficult for us to reliably extract which one sends people back to your website to be able to look at the object on your website, all the descriptive information that you've put in. So pay attention to field order as well, and try to maintain that consistency, not just within a collection, but across collections. Next, and probably one that people are more familiar with, and I should note that if I've tried to take out all references to where these examples came from, if you happen to notice that one of these examples is yours, I am not picking on you. We all have things with metadata. You probably were just a collection I was working with recently, so you were fresh in my mind to put for examples. Patterns in format of non-free text fields. So these are going to be fields like format, medium, DCMI type. They aren't going to necessarily be fields like description, where you can type a big long paragraph or two of text. On the left, this is what we would probably map to our medium field. And you can see at the top, there's 4 different variations of what should probably be the same thing. Black and white photographs, and then we've got black and white prints. Now, when we're ingesting stuff into the DLG, we know to look for these discrepancies, and we try very hard to make sure that we're collapsing any sort of duplicate terms or anything that might be off because of punctuation or capitalization. But if you're working with, say, a mathematician who's looking for paintings or photographs, and he or she isn't as familiar with the way that we describe things, they might see the first few entries are listed as black and white photographs, as it's listed at the top, and wind up missing about 170 photographs that they could use from your collections in their research because they weren't aware that they needed to find these different variations of the term. Another good example of this is on the right. This is a spatial location field. And this is really great because the format of the locations are all the same. It looks like Library of Congress headings. It is a place followed by a state in parentheses. But if you look at the top arrow, it is city followed by county. The middle arrow is state followed by county, and the third arrow is county followed by city. And so if we wanted to extract all of the cities out of this particular data set, of which there are 175 choices and who knows how many of them are cities, it would be really difficult for us to say, okay, the city always comes first, so make sure you give me everything before the semicolon, or make sure you give me everything after the last semicolon. We'd have to do a fair amount more digging into the data to figure out whether or not where all your cities were and whether we were extracting them properly. If you're working, or if you've got somebody who's doing large-scale data research, they might not know that there's all of these variations in order. So when they pulled, everything before the first semicolon, they'd get a lot of cities, but they'd wind up with a lot of stuff that they didn't expect to see. So they wouldn't have the most accurate results, and they wouldn't be able to use that. And worst case scenario, they wouldn't be able to use your location information at all because there wasn't enough consistency for them to be able to extract that information. And the last pattern I want to point out is patterns in identifying information. And this is not related to the descriptive information about the content of the object. I think a lot of people who have their own asset management systems, for good reason, don't realize that when you're using information in bulk, you don't have the luxury of having branding associated with it, right? So this is actually the screenshot on the right is the OAI record of the image, the object on the left. On the left, you see this clearly comes from Georgia State University. You've got a lot of really clear identifying information. And in the record on the right, the only thing that says Georgia State University is in the publisher field. If Georgia State wasn't the publisher of this particular item, it would be really difficult, except for maybe tracing back identifier or URL patterns to know where this particular bit of information came from. So adding holding institution information, your information, while it might seem a bit redundant to include that in your metadata that's publicly available, it really can be important for researchers who are using this from the back channel of access and not your branded front channel of access. I also want to include in here collection information, because there are some content management systems that you can't, you can ask for records not for a particular collection. So you might get lots and lots of different results from lots and lots of different collections. And if there is no collection information in there, it can be really difficult to go, oh, I want more of this. But where did this come from? So in terms of structure, those are some of the things that we see that, some of the most important things that we see to consider when you're developing and building your digital collections. There are some other considerations that make bulk access easier. Multiple metadata schemas is a really big one. If you have a asset management system that provides an OAI feed, chances are it allows you the option to provide multiple different metadata schemas. Usually that's something like doubling core, qualified doubling core, METs and mods. If you have those options and it's as easy as clicking a couple of buttons to turn them on, I highly suggest that you do it. You don't know who is going to be more familiar with which schema. And so why not, if the transformations are already written for you, allow them to access that information in the ways that they are most comfortable with seeing that information. Now, I would caution you against writing your own transformations, like trying to translate whatever your asset management system sends out into something else, unless you know that there is a good, robust use case for it, because that can be really time consuming and challenging, not just to develop, but to maintain. The other consideration is different delivery options, if you have that option available to you. So in the case of the DLG, we provide things in XML. People in library land and archive land tend to be familiar with XML. We also provide a JSON endpoint, though. A lot of web and computer science people are very familiar with JSON. So we provide that endpoint as well in case they don't feel like working with the XML or they're more comfortable working with that. I will say that if you decide to offer a different sort of endpoint, provide documentation. We provide documentation on our website of both versions of our endpoints. We'll tell you how to ask our system for results, what each query will do, what you should expect to see in response, and give you some examples. So we know that people who are accessing our information this way have a bit of guidance as to how to get at what they want from our asset management system. So I'm gonna finish up by talking about some things we see from common asset management systems in use around the state and really the country. This is not a sales pitch for any one of these systems. This is just, we work with them a lot, and these are some common things we see on export or on harvesting of records. So the first one that I want to talk about is CONTENTdm. CONTENTdm is in use in a lot of academic and non-academic libraries. It's not as popular in, say, like the museum and gallery world. So the really great thing about CONTENTdm, it's developed by OCLC. They provide a lot of customization across collections, right? Which is a really good thing because you can tailor collections to your particular content needs. However, that means there is a lot of customization across collections, which can be really bad for maintaining that consistency and the patterns that I was talking about earlier. So what we do suggest is using the template feature. So you can set up a template or set up a collection as a template. And when you create a new digital collection, you can choose to use that previous one, and it will transfer all of the settings, all of the fields, all of the mappings over into it. So it's really easy to maintain that original structure that you set up for your metadata without having to do a bunch of legwork. CONTENTdm does also allow you to set up controlled vocabularies. These are really great, especially for smaller sets of controlled vocabularies like DCMI type. If you have something that you know you're going to be entering over and over again, we highly recommend taking advantage of their controlled vocabulary feature. You can also fill fields on import. Which means that if you have some information like holding institution, that is always going to be your institution's name, you can ask the system, you can input the way you want it to appear in the record and ask the system to automatically attach it to any record that's ingested. And the good thing about this is that if it's always going to be the same information, you can eliminate the margin of error for proper capitalization or punctuation or different forms of the word, and just say, you know what, stick this value in every single time. It does have also some neat features, like you can read file extensions and things like that. We do have a configuring and importing document. This is not, this was written when we were doing some training with a CONTENTdm user. It is not intended to be a tutorial for using CONTENTdm. It is more like a suggestions on how to set up and map your fields for harvesting. And it is a lot of the information that I was just talking about. Next, I want to talk a little bit about PastPerfect museum software, or specifically PastPerfect Online, which is a slightly different version of PastPerfect museum software. This is more familiar. We have a lot of museums that use PastPerfect. It allows you to do like regular accession and collection management, and then has a portion that you can push things to be accessible on the web, which is really awesome. So one thing to note about PastPerfect Online is that it doesn't have a public harvesting endpoint. So there is no OAI endpoint or API. So there is no way for us to actually grab that information. It does, however, allow for exporting of the data into Excel and I think into a couple of other formats. So that's great, because that means that you can put all of your information into PastPerfect and export it and contribute to aggregation projects that way. The caveat with that is, up until the most recent version of PastPerfect Online, it did not export URLs. A PastPerfect URL can be seen below my bulleted list. It is an arbitrary string of letters and numbers after the beginning prefix. And it is something that we can't predict. It becomes problematic, because if there's no harvesting endpoint and you can't export your URLs, how do you get access to that information? And we have actually developed a system in order to do that, but what it does rely on is having a unique piece of information that we can search for in a very specific way to avoid the random search results that PastPerfect provides. And we'll search for that, and then we'll be able to kind of crawl through your site and get that information, a title and a URL, which we can then match to and export. But the kicker is you have to have that unique piece of identifying information. So in this screenshot, you can see that it's a collection name, that this collection name was attached to every single photo in this particular collection, which was awesome, because we could then reliably go in and say, I want everything in this collection, and get the information we need. So this collection is actually online. This collection is ingested into the DLG website, and we are able to send people back to the city of Savannah's website because of it. I will say that if you have PastPerfect Online and you have the most recent version, I would be really happy to work with you to test out whether or not we actually do get URLs. If you have PastPerfect Online and you don't have the most recent version, I would be happy to work with you to see if we have the information we need to make the magic happen and get your stuff ingested into DLG. The last asset management system that I'm going to briefly touch on is Omeka. Omeka is great because it's got a really low barrier to access. There are free versions of it. It's fairly easy to pick up and run with. A lot of people use it for exhibits, but there are people who use it as a full-fledged asset management system, and it seems to work really great. One of the things that I will caution you when you are working with Omeka is that exhibits often get less metadata love. You're putting together a bunch of resources for something that's usually not going to be considered permanent. However, what Omeka does is it pulls from the digital objects that you've put online to put these exhibits together. So when we harvest from Omeka, we're harvesting the digital objects and not the exhibit itself. We'll get the metadata for each digital object, but not what you've entered into that exhibit portion of Omeka. And that's great, so long as you understand that if you don't take the time to enter a full metadata record, we won't get a full metadata record. And often what we do see coming out of Omeka exhibits are things that are not particularly helpful, right? In this particular example, contributor, we have no idea what this means. If we have enough information to put this into our database, then we will, but a lot of times we don't even see enough information coming out of Omeka to be able to ingest the records in. I also want to note that there's often multiple unexpected fields, and this is not, I don't think this has anything to do with the users or how it's being used. I think it has to do with how images are ingested into Omeka. But for example, we will see in a DC identifier field the link to the digital object, but we will also see 4 or 5 or even 6 other URLs, sometimes to variations of object like image resolution. Sometimes we're not sure what they go to. They're not visible in the public interface. So I think it's an artifact of something Omeka is doing with the images. However, this is a good space to be aware of where field order is really important, because if we can ensure that your digital object URL is always the first one coming out of Omeka, then we can make sure that we're pointing people back to the site when you're as appropriate. So that is my run through of how we use data and structuring data for bulk. So I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions in case people had particular questions about their data or their particular asset management system. So I welcome you all to type in the chat box.
Okay, Michael from from the Salvation Army says that they use PastPerfect online and have successfully had users cut and paste URLs into emails or texts from searches to request higher res or alternate format images.
Right, yeah, PastPerfect is really good. So what I didn't mean to infer was that the URLs themselves are randomized every time someone visits them. Hopefully, I should clarify in saying that there's no way for us to generate that URL. We would have to copy and paste it off of the website, but those URLs are static. So as long as we have a way of matching those URLs to an export, then we can absolutely rely on those URLs. And Michael, if you're interested in playing around with exporting and ingesting stuff into DLG, I would be happy to. Oh, interesting. I'll have to look into that. Thank you. For people not looking at the chat or not joining us, he mentioned that CDL got a grant to work with it somehow. And though he doesn't know the details, it's something that I would definitely be interested in looking into. So thank you.
This is Sheila. At the last Digital Library Federation meeting, forum meeting, folks from the California Digital Library mentioned that they were working with PastPerfect to change, to make it more harvestable. So, and I think that's when they added the URL exporting.
Yeah, which is fantastic. And I'm hoping we see more people upgrading, though I do know we have had some talks with content partners that had recently just upgraded their PastPerfect and weren't willing to upgrade quite yet again to the newest version. So there seems to be multiple versions running concurrently, and we will try to work with whatever version you happen to be running on.
So I have a question for the audience. Are there any asset management systems that we didn't talk about today that you would like more information about? Here's a question for you, Nicole. This is from Allison. I can't quite remember where she's from. If they are continuously updating their database with new objects, how will that work with DLG integration? Would we have to reintegrate every time we update something, or will you just be linked in somehow?
So that largely depends on how you provide information to us. If you have an asset management system that provides an OAI endpoint or some other sort of API, that's the lowest barrier to contributing to DLG because you don't actually have to do any work. What we'll do is set you up on a quarterly ingest schedule. And so we'll do the initial round of pulling information from you, and then on a set schedule, check to see if anything's changed, updated, been added. And we can do that continually without, unless there's issues, without any further demand on you. If you are working with an asset management system that does not have an endpoint that we can access like that, then hopefully you can export materials, or export records, I'm sorry. And you could, whenever you got a chunk of materials, new materials into the system, send us the new records and we could ingest them that way.
Hey, Nicole, we've got another question for you from Mike, who's at the Fulton County Schools Archives. And he's wondering if there is a resource that will help you navigate in detail the many management systems to find out the best fit.
Oh, man. The short answer to that is no, although I'm sure the vendors would love for you to have them call each salesperson. There is a fair amount of technical information available on most management system websites. We are always available to answer questions for you if you are looking through websites to kind of help you navigate what you may or may not need. We do consultations regularly with people who are looking at different systems and try to kind of help them figure out what they're looking for and what they actually need out of a system before they enter into vendor talks, if that's a thing that they are going to have to do. So no, unfortunately, there's not one big place that you can go and just kind of compare CONTENTdm with PastPerfect and Islandora and Samvera. But we are always happy to put you in touch with people that we know that use the systems, so you can have conversations kind of outside the vendor loop if that is something that would be helpful.
And really, I think as you get started looking at different kinds of management systems, there are a few basic things that you really want to think about. One is, do you need something that is a turnkey? Is to look at your the kind of IT support that you have at your organization. So is it something, do you have enough IT support that it's something that you can have hosted yourself, or do you have enough IT support that that you could use something that's more customizable? And if you or are you in a situation where you really need something that's a hosted resource? And of course, not surprisingly, budget is always sort of a guiding factor in the decisions that you want to make. So I think for us, when we start talking to people about potential asset management systems, those are probably the first questions we ask, along with what kinds of functionalities that you need. We always recommend that you work with a system that will either allow you to export, have it, or a system that has an API or is OAI enabled so that you can get your data easily out. Other questions?
So, Mike, to your comment of why you use Omeka, you are in the same boat as a lot of people. The reason that Omeka, PastPerfect, and CONTENTdm were my examples is because they are the ones that are kind of the, they are easy enough for folks who don't have a lot of IT support, who can't hire a developer, who can't do a lot of customization. They're the three most readily available options. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with using Omeka if it fits your budget and your level of IT support. Any other burning questions? Okay, so this is a very interesting comment, talking about a vendor who was claiming that stable URLs were impossible, that they are continually changing as people are interacting with a museum object. And the only way to access it for sure is internally. I would say that's probably, that works based on the way a system is designed. So I will say, and I'm not sure which product you're referring to, and I don't know the ins and outs of how all of these products are built, but I will say that there are certain products that are built that aren't designed to have a stable public user interface, and they have added that sort of feature so that they can meet client demands, which is understandable. But they were inherently built to manage a collection internally and deal with accessions, and stable URLs weren't necessarily built as part of the plan. There are other systems that maintain a certain amount of stability. In theory, I guess no URL is ever perfectly stable. It's always at risk of changing. But there are increasingly, asset management systems are designed with the idea that access needs to be stable and that URLs need to be stable. So you see a lot more products moving towards a stable URL, regardless of how they structure it. So I will say, for example, CONTENTdm URLs tend to be very stable. They have a reference URL that you can pretty much always rely on unless something really drastic happens to the system, like they have to migrate from a local instance to a hosted instance. And even in those transitions, the actual identifying information in the URL stays the same. It's just the prefix portion that changes. So I know that's not quite exactly an answer to how does that work. But I would guess it's because the system was originally designed without the intent of having permanently publicly accessible images or objects.
If there aren't any more questions, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank Nicole for her presentation and to reiterate that we're always here to help if you have questions about metadata or systems or anything digital for that matter. And I wanted to also thank you all for coming and joining us at this webinar.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a blast.